I'm glad you're joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in January of 2021. Today, we're going to be talking with legal scholar and professor Maneesha Deckha and her legal position on non-human animals as legal beings rather than legal status as objects or persons. This is outlined in her new book with University of Toronto Press called Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders. Let me tell you about her. Maneesha Deckha earned her legal degrees from Columbia University and University of Toronto and is now a professor and the Lansdowne Chair at the Faculty of Law, University of Victoria and British Columbia, Canada. Her research and teaching interests include critical animal law, feminist analysis of law, postcolonial legal studies, reproductive rights, health law, and bioethics. Her work has been published in Canada and internationally in socio-legal and interdisciplinary journals. She has also contributed to multiple anthologies related to critical animal studies, feminism, cultural pluralism, and health law and policy. And she's the recipient of grants from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the Canada-US Fulbright Program. Professor Deckha has held the Fulbright Visiting Chair in Law and Society at NYU. She currently serves on the editorial boards of Politics and Animals and Hypatia journals. She's also the founder and academic director of the Animals and Society Research Initiative at University of Victoria. Welcome, Professor Deckha.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I've cited your work in my own writing, so it's really an honor to have you on the show.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking, where did the idea for this book, Animals as Legal Beings, originate? What led you to write it?
Oh my goodness. That is a decades-long story. I also wanted to write kind of, a book length, a monograph on my views about what's wrong with the property status of animals.
Right.
And the idea, though, that I was going to kind of take a stand, as I do in the book, against personhood, which is kind of like the natural legal status that people who don't like property as a legal status for animals turn to. That idea came more recently, I would say maybe 5-6 years ago, when I really, reflected on the implications of what the law said a person is and whether or not that was an animal-friendly status or not.
Okay.
And I did that reflection through various forms of critical theory and theorizing.
Yeah.
And so then kind of the book came together as, not only do I want to critique the property status of animals from a critical theoretical perspective, as I hadn't really seen done, at that time in a longer writing project. I also, though, wanted to critique personhood, which was more of a novel position in the animal law world. So the book generated, it's really in law school, when I was able to find a professor to supervise a directed reading on a critical, take on the property status of animals. And I was able to come back to it in future years to then, take a critical appraisal also of personhood, and then kind of write the chapters that flowed from that, or that it kind of needed to be written to supplement what it would mean for this new beingness status to develop.
Yeah, so I like that you're actually proposing it's not just a critique of one approach, but it's a suggestion of another. So tell us the premise of your Animals as Legal Beings book, like your main argument.
Yeah, so the main argument is that property obviously is a problem for animals.
Mm-hmm.
That sets, and I make that argument in a somewhat truncated way, using the Canadian legal landscape as a case study and as a stand-in for all anthropocentric legal systems. And then that lets me turn to, well, what about personhood? And that's where I make the argument that, personhood is also problematic for animals, and this is why. And the prongs of that argument is basically to look at its liberal humanist history, to suggest and really to demonstrate, more than suggest, that personhood, even when we talk about it today in contemporary times, is very much a legal concept imprinted by this exclusionary history that obviously formally subordinated most groups of human people,
Right.
even if those groups are formally equal today, but definitely still subordinates animals. I take on the challenge, well, can't we rehabilitate the concept of personhood and recuperate it from this history and
Yeah.
extend personhood to animals as we've extended it to previously marginalized human groups like women and otherwise? And I said, well, yes, that could be done, but personhood would still retain its kind of exclusionary mold. And I make the case that the exclusion can't be done away with just a simple extension, because built in to the property person divide, which is so foundational to the common law legal order that the United States, that Canada, other previous colonial jurisdictions have inherited, right, and still living with this kind of colonial legal order, that it actually pivots property and personhood as legal concepts, actually pivots on a human animal divide, such that you can't just move animals from the property status and elevate them to personhood status and without really undoing the human animal divide that shores that up. Like, it doesn't really make any sense. And the third problem with that argument is that, okay, well, let's concede I'm wrong about those other two prongs, the problematic history and its imprints today, and the fact that, person property divide in law really only makes sense when there's a species divide, such that you can't make animals persons without basically de-animalizing them, which is not what I want to do.
Right.
The book wants to respect the alterity and difference of animals, to not make them into honorary humans. But in the third prong, I said, well, what if I'm wrong about all of that? Personhood itself is a concept that is not going to materialize tomorrow in legal circles for animals in terms of being implemented. Right. Many still see it as a reality that's far, far off. So if we're starting basically from first principles and looking for, let's say, transformative status, let's really make it something transformative. We don't need to go to existing legal categories all the time, especially ones that have this type of baggage attached to it that's not easily done away with. Let's develop something from first principles, from the ground up, that could be more animal friendly. And I suggest that's what beingness is.
Interesting. So what makes aiming for the status of beingness, and you'll probably need to describe what beingness is, what makes beingness a better long-term legal strategy than aiming for something like personhood or selfhood or citizenship or some other status?
Right. Okay. So legal personhood is caught in a certain conceptual space. Interestingly, despite its kind of foundational identity in legal landscapes, right? Like how are we made into contracting subjects? How are we made into subjects who can, enter into a contract? It's because the law sees us as a subject. How are corporations made into subjects? Through this vehicle of personhood, where we're seen as a subject, not an object, and we get to hold rights actually in property. So persons are those who hold rights in property, to kind of put it, very simplistically. Interestingly, when you kind of scan legal texts, so I'm talking here about decisions coming from courts, even statutes coming from legislatures, parliaments, there's not a lot of definition or defining or attention or discussion on what personhood means. It's one of those concepts that are just taken for granted.
Yeah.
But when you turn to scholarly work, where legal scholars have actually tried to excavate this concept from these legal texts, they show that there are different meanings of personhood. One is the meaning that lets a corporation be a person and has let a corporation be a person for centuries now, which is just personhood can be applied to anything. It's like this empty vessel type of concept. And that's, of course, why many animal lawyers turn to it, because animals then can be persons, just like corporations can be persons, or rivers can be persons, just like corporations can be persons. You don't need to be a human being.
It's like just a way to raise your status to
Right.
get rights. Yeah.
So a legal person is anyone who a court says is a legal person, or anyone that a democratically elected legislature in passing a statute says is a person. That's how corporations became persons, right? Through a judgment that said that, and quite uncontroversially. But there's also a very prominent strand of personhood where it is discussed that really models the ideal person, that really says who's a person in law. It's this like person who basically has no body, has no social identity, and who privileges a life of reason over everything else, so that they're able to maximally reason, and they go about their lives entering contracts or what have you, as a reason and economic maximizer. Now, many feminist scholars, legal scholars, have talked about how this person doesn't exist, and nobody runs their life like this. And this idea that we come into this world without a body, that we are completely independent, that's another critical feature of personhood, and that we are always this paradigmatic reasoner, that no one lives up to this. And even if we just take that reasoning feature, we know that not all humans can, even as adults, can live up to this ideal. And certainly we come into this life with a different type of reasoning ability, and we may leave this life with a different type of reasoning ability, even if at some point during our lives we reach this idea of a paradigmatic reasoner. Okay, but the law still assumes this, and this kind of comes out in its very prominent concept of the reasonable person. So a lot of legal tests ask about what would the reasonable person do, and that's how we decide what's kind of wrong and right, what legal principles should be. So, as many critical theorists, feminist theorists, anti-colonial theorists, disability theorists have argued, this is a really troubling concept. It's exclusionary, it's obviously ableist, and it has histories of other exclusion in terms of gender, race, class, age. Okay, and a lot of child rights scholars write about this, right? That really, I mean, many people talk about, without kind of any hint of embarrassment, of children as quasi-persons because they haven't reached this state of reasoning. So my intervention in the animal legal world is to recognize why animal lawyers want the law to recognize person for animals. Is because that's the status that protects them from exploitation. When we are recognized as persons, at least theoretically, we're not supposed to be property, right? They're mutually exclusive categories, and we're not supposed to be used without our consent for any means, instrumental means or agendas of anyone else. So we can understand why test case litigation asks for legal personhood. But at the same time, when you look at most test case litigation for animals, who are the animal subjects that become kind of the poster child or children for this test case litigation? It's invariably the animals that can kind of be made to be seen as human-like, or become, as other people have argued, honorary humans.
Like those charismatic megafauna, like mammals, you know, like elephants and dolphins and whales and chimpanzees and animals like that, maybe dogs.
Exactly. And it's really the first set, Carrie, that you mentioned, at least in Canada, the United States.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the farmed animals.
Right. It's not rats or chickens or snakes or frogs.
Exactly. So, and why is that? It's because law is a very conservative enterprise.
Yeah.
And the idea of precedent is that you have to kind of look for precedent to make it a movement in a new area.
Yeah.
The qualities of beingness that a court should value, or legislators, policymakers thinking about new laws to come into being, to codify, to bring about, should value, are not whether someone can reason. It's just the fact that someone has basically an embodied being, that they can not just feel pain, but it goes kind of a bit deeper than that, that we have
Is it like consciousness? There's always these categories that we're always wrestling with. How do we describe subjecthood or selfhood or consciousness or something like that?
It's not a mental criteria.
Okay.
I mean it just to be the kind of existence of having a body.
Okay.
It's the idea of embodiment. The fact that we are relational, animals including, right, are relational, and that animals are vulnerable. So the three features of, so just like today, personhood is kind of marked by the features of complete autonomy and disembodiment and hyper-rationality. Beingness is marked by the features of relationality, vulnerability, and embodiment.
And we're all beings. So you and I and our dogs and frogs and everybody is a being.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So animals other than, so humans can be beings, and other types of non-humans could be beings. And I discuss that in one chapter of the book, but my focus is on really making the argument as to why animals need a different status in personhood, and that they can be beings, and what beingness means and how they can be beings. Yes.
Okay. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman, interviewing legal scholar Maneesha Deckha, professor and Lansdowne chair at the Faculty of Law, University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. We're talking about her new book with the University of Toronto Press called Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders. Maneesha, how did your perspectives as a feminist scholar and post-colonial scholar inform your analysis for this book, Animals as Legal Beings? Because I can see some of it in there with the idea of wanting to avoid that exclusionary concept of this quote unquote ideal person who is some kind of man, in some Enlightenment sense. And so can you explain how beingness also kind of fits with feminism and critical animal studies and post-colonial scholarship, kind of briefly? You can spend an hour on that, but just briefly.
Yes, sure. Thank you for that question, Carrie. So yeah, my academic training it was exactly in those areas. It wasn't in animal studies, or let alone critical animal studies, or anything that was like that available in the earlier 90s when I was an undergrad. But I quickly kind of started thinking through the term papers I was writing in these types of courses, feminist theory, the post-colonial courses, about the whole idea of othering and the kind of Western Cartesian binaries that set up structural systems of hierarchies and oppression, And there was very much like this mood of deconstruction, but I didn't see much attention to deconstructing the human animal boundary, which to me seemed very much like an artifice, as well as, let's say, man versus woman, or culture over nature, reason over emotion, mind over body. So I then, once I kind of came into my academic position and started writing and teaching, I really wanted to take on kind of what I saw as the core tenets of feminism, and very much what had risen up by then, which is the claims of intersectionality or third wave feminism. To say, well, if we really want to deconstruct differences and think about identities, what is really core to our identities is our human status as well. And we need to see kind of what the forces of anthropocentrism are in our lives, not only recognize that like as a point of privilege vis-a-vis non-humans, but also think about how anthropocentrism as a system is very much related to the other types of, isms that we say are related, and which I believe are related. And so that's part comes into the book when thinking about personhood and beingness, because personhood comes out of a very anthropocentric legal order, and anthropocentrism in the law has been devastating for peoples who are seen to be non-Western, in terms of the non-recognition or the derision of indigenous legal systems, pre-existing legal systems in spaces that were colonized, which perhaps gave a much higher status to animals, or even saw animals as kin rather than just as mere objects, right? And feminist theory is really important kind of in the whole illumination of the harms of the current animal industrial complex, because but for the reproductive capacities of female mammals, you wouldn't have an animal industrial complex, right? We need to keep producing animals to keep using them, whether it's to eat them or otherwise. And whose reproductive labor is appropriated and violated, and whose families are decimated from this type of harnessing of animal capital. That's a core critique that feminism has made about women and the integrity of their bodies. And so even beyond kind of looking at Cartesian problematic dualisms about man over women, mind over body, reason over emotion, how that's harmful to women and other marginalized groups, this is a core point drawing feminist concerns to animal concerns, just looking at how the power structures really depend on the complete, not just commodification of animals, but a very gendered commodification of reproduction. And perhaps no more visible, or just the most visible in the dairy industry, when you think about appropriating the lactation and the birthing and the milk of another mammal for humans, which is supposed to go to a non-human.
Absolutely.
Mothering relationship that is devastating.
Yeah. And we are running out of time, but I hope that our listeners have established that your book would be something worth reading. Definitely, I'm going to read it. It's just come out. Because it would be a revolutionary new way to think about our legal system. And we can see, I like how you're making connections with marginalized human groups, and just even questioning the very notion of personhood and how it's been established, and that there could be another category, which is much more universal in its recognition. So I think it's, really astounding and important what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you also for your work.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Professor Deckha, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I hope the ideas in your book have a profound influence on legal views of non-human and human animals to raise their status for the benefit of all of us.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone in the audience.
Yeah, take care. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, facebook.com/In Tune to Nature. You can also find podcasts on popular streaming sites. The views and opinions expressed on In Tune to Nature do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species or other beings. Thank you for listening. Cheers.